It's Wednesday night, First Baptist Church, Jasper, Georgia. Welcome to Wednesday night's Bible study. I'm glad that you are joining with us. If you're joining us for the first time, we're exceptionally glad that you're here. And tonight is the second night of our First to Follow series. So we are talking about the ones who were first to follow Jesus. And we're looking at them from more of a historical setting. We look at some of the stories from the scriptures and we kind of get an idea who they are, but they had lives outside of that. And they had lives after, many of them had lives after Jesus. So we're going to look at four characters tonight: James and John, who were brothers, Philip, and Bartholomew. Now Bartholomew, we'll get to later, had another name that he was known by. Now let's start with James, the brother of John, one of the Zebedee boys. His mother was named Salome. Now, it could be pronounced otherwise, but that's just the best translation that you get from me tonight. Salome. One of the first group to follow Jesus from Capernaum, fishermen, was one of Jesus's kind of inner circle as he functioned with all the other disciples. You see James and later his brother John mentioned in these bigger stories of the Transfiguration, the Garden of Gethsemane, that those disciples were there. Now, the scholars often call these guys sons of thunder. You know, they're translated, that name Zebedee was sons of thunder. And it may be kind of translated what scholars believe is their volatile personalities. They're ones that maybe had a lot of energy, and some of that energy came out so much in not the most positive ways. They, at one time, when the Samaritans in town wouldn't welcome Jesus and the disciples, James offers to call down fire on the town. And Jesus said, no, we don't need to do that. There was a time when James and John tried to cook up, pushing their mama to say, hey, go ask if James and John could sit on the left and the right hand side of Jesus. That's when Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. And then the third time where they kind of get this volatile personality from is when James comes and he shames and forbids this outsider. In his eyes, he doesn't know him, but who's casting out demons in Luke 9. And that's when Jesus looks at, James and says, whoever's not against us is for us. He's doing good work. Just let him continue on. Now, James is the first disciple to be martyred. He was one who died at the hands of Herod. He was beheaded. So, now his brother John, as we move on to him, was, Zebedee boy. Mama was Salome. One of the first to follow in that inner circle from Capernaum. He was mentioned a total of 30 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Galatians, and Acts. He was not mentioned, the name John was not mentioned in the book of John. Now, there's 5 references to the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, some scholars believe that that's actually referring to John himself, where some scholars don't necessarily agree with that. He was a fishing partner with his brother. Mark in his book refers to the hired servants of Zebedee. So this idea that the Zebedee family had means if they had servants. And that it was believed that Salome was the sister of, it was believed she was a sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. So this would have made James and John first cousins with Jesus. So, John, like James, was someone that Jesus had to correct on an occasional basis. Salome, because of their family of means, was one who was believed by scholars who financed Jesus' ministry. John had a unique relationship with Peter. He was entrusted with John and Peter were entrusted to build to create the meal for the Last Supper, to find a room. John and Peter were imprisoned together in Acts. They also worked together, and they worked together by going to Samaria to see how Philip was doing in his ministry. They were also known as pillars of the church. John was considered a pillar of the church by Paul. And also, Paul thought that about James too, John's brother. After Jesus' ministry, after he left Jerusalem, he ended up in Ephesus. After in Ephesus for a while, he was banished to Patmos, the island, later released, and then he died a natural death in Ephesus. And scholars are not exactly sure when the date was, but it was between, they believe, 98 and 117 AD. So that kind of wraps up John. Philip. Now, Philip was a Jew, a close companion of Nathanael. Dear friends, the Synoptic Gospels and Acts only mention him in the list of disciples. So they don't mention him necessarily in doing a lot of extra, there's not any accounts of Philip. Now in John, there are 4 accounts of Philip. There's when Philip introduces Nathanael to Jesus, the feeding of the multitude, when he introduces some Greeks to Jesus, and he's also involved during the Passion narrative, when Jesus is arresting during the time from the arrest to the crucifixion. Also, Philip is known as an evangelist and a deacon who works in Samaria, doing kingdom of God, telling the story of Jesus there. Now Bartholomew is the last disciple we'll talk about tonight. He was also known as Nathanael. So I think in the Synoptic Gospels he's listed as Bartholomew. In John he's mentioned as Nathanael. Came from Cana in Galilee. Was one who didn't have a high opinion of folks from Nazareth. If you remember when Philip says, "Hey, I want you to meet this guy. His name's Jesus. He's great. I'm following him. You should think about it." And he says, there's nothing good that comes out of Nazareth. And he meets Jesus, and Jesus makes this declaration about Nathanael as being this very impressive person, that he sees the love of God is just very evident within Nathanael. Nathanael is one who ends up going to India and begins to live out and talk about the gospel in India. He translates the book of Matthew in India into the native language there. And Bartholomew had kind of a tough ending. He was beaten, he was crucified, and he was beheaded. So he died as a martyr in Armenia. So he eventually left from India to go to Armenia. So these were a glimpse of 4 more of the folks who first followed Jesus. Not folks that had any kind of religious training, but just hardworking, everyday folks who were not perfect, but who wanted to be about something that was about helping people. And so next week we'll finish up. We'll talk about the remaining disciples. We're the first to follow. So thanks for joining me. Hope you have a good night, and see you next week.